The title of the session is Expanding the Boundaries of Science. Our sincere thanks to the Cosmos magazine, and I was disappointed to see that they're giving them away for nothing out there. It's disgraceful. You should be buying a copy because it's a gem of a magazine, and I recommend that if you do get a copy, have a look at it. It is exquisite. So go online and subscribe. My name's Melbourne Frankel, and I spent about 40 years or so as a research scientist. Now, my impact on science was minuscule, but I mean that in the most positive way. But the impact of science on me has always been beyond measure. I'm a child entering a room labelled science that is forever replete with myriad mysterious wonders. Science, like literature, is about ideas and their ultimate expression through the written word. If we can't talk or write about what we've done, who's going to pay any attention to it? So, let's get underway. The world of science is filled with the most remarkable ideas and stories. These are stories that challenge the imagination through their exquisite complexity and beauty. Stories that demand ethical examination of astonishingly powerful capabilities, and stories that question our impact on the very future of life on this planet. And tonight we're fortunate to have as our guests two extraordinary science storytellers. Recently appointed Chief Scientist of Australia, Dr. Elizabeth Finkel, and Editor-in-Chief of Cosmos magazine, Dr. Elizabeth Finkel. Now, I've got to be careful because when I say Finkel, I almost say Frankel, so
yeah, that's right.
Just be careful.
It's all relative.
Alan has an extensive science background as an engineer, neuroscientist and educator. And as Chief Scientist, his brief is to provide high-level independent advice to the government on matters relating to science, technology and innovation. In a country whose governments have often only paid lip service to the importance of science, this is indeed a formidable undertaking. Elizabeth has a background in biochemistry, and together with Alan and others, co-founded Cosmos magazine in 2015. This much acclaimed...
2005.
It's a typo, sorry. 2005. Yeah, well, 2015 is only a year ago. Sorry about that. This, you did read this before I...
Did I reply to your email?
This much acclaimed, accessible, high-quality magazine is one of ideas, science, society and the future. And it's won almost 50 journalism and industry awards. In 2015, Elizabeth won the Eureka Prize for Science Journalism, and I certainly recommend it to you all. And now let Alan and Elizabeth take us on a journey that looks back towards the beginning of time and then explores some challenges of our immediate and short-term future. 100 years ago, this year, Albert Einstein predicted the existence of gravitational waves as a consequence of his general theory of relativity, but he doubted that we would ever detect them. It's my pleasure to ask Alan to describe what such waves are. Tell us about the remarkable achievement of confirming their existence and what he believes are some implications of this discovery. Alan.
That's a challenge, Murray. Thank you. Probably best to start with two different time frames. So think about 1.3 billion years. It's a lot of years. 1.3 billion years ago, far, far away, there were two black holes that were coming slightly towards each other, but not for a head-on collision, travelling towards each other and noticed each other. Now, park that idea and come back to Albert Einstein, who Maury pointed out, well, didn't really point out, but we've all heard of Albert Einstein. He's done a lot. In 1905, he published 4 papers working from the patent office, didn't even have a lab. Every single one of those 4 papers deserved a Nobel Prize. One on how molecules work, one on photons, and of course the very big one on special relativity, and one on the equivalence of mass and energy. But he kept thinking, never went to a lab bench, kept thinking. In 1915, he published an update to the special theory of relativity called the general theory of relativity, which brought gravity and light together under one theory. And he worked out, just purely by thinking about it, that gravity distorts space and space-time, and light travelling through that distorted space itself gets distorted. And he realised that light had wave properties, and he worked out mathematically that gravity must have wave properties, but we don't normally see it. The gravity that holds you down in your seats is absolutely constant. There's no wave motion at all. You're not bobbing up and down. The gravity from the sun that holds the earth is absolutely constant. What he worked out is only when there's an extraordinary event involving huge amounts of mass that the fabric of space-time gets distorted by that mass and sends out ripples. So he predicted that when major things happened, like the collision of 2 big stars, there would be an emanation of gravitational waves. He had no idea about black holes because they weren't conceived of at that time, but he knew that it would require very big stars. And so he predicted gravitational waves, but suggested that probably we would never be able to detect them. In the intervening 100 years, everything that was predicted by general relativity except for gravitational waves has been proven again and again and again. The fact that time slows down when a clock is moving. You can take 2 atomic clocks that keep perfect time day after day. You can't tell any difference. Put one on just a regular aeroplane, Qantas, take it all the way around the world and bring it back, and it'll be a few milliseconds different to the one that stayed behind. It's been proven again and again exactly according to his predictions. The fact that light gets bent by gravity has been shown during the eclipses of the sun. Light doesn't go in a straight line anymore, it bends. But the one thing they were never able to prove was gravitational waves. They never disproved it, they never proved it. A lot of physicists were determined to try and look into this. And starting in the 1960s, a professor in America named Weber, started building devices to do this, and he thought he found things, but every time it was an artefact. Then in the 1970s, a decade later, an Australian from University of Western Australia, David Blair, and many others started trying to develop ever more sophisticated equipment. And they just couldn't measure gravitational waves. They got money from the American government in the 1980s, the late 1980s, and started building bigger and bigger detectors until finally about just under 10 years ago, they got billions of dollars, and they developed this enormous machine, which I'll tell you about later if there's time, to try to detect gravitational waves. And last September, after developing this machine, and it was the year 2015, 100 years from when Einstein predicted gravitational waves, so it's an incredible coincidence that something happened in September. They finished this machine called the Advanced LIGO Detector, and they turned it on, and 1 hour later they detected an extraordinarily significant gravitational wave event. And since then, they've not announced any others. We don't even know if they've found any others. So the coincidence of 100 years, as soon as they turned it on, is quite exciting. What they saw was a little blip of an output from this machine that went like this, got faster and faster, and went very big. And if you connected that to speakers, it would go whoop, and that was about the duration of it. And what it corresponded to was 1.3 billion years ago, those 2 black holes coming towards each other and getting trapped in each other's gravitational field and spiralling in. And big as they are, the last movement together only took about 1/10 of a second. And the 2 black holes, each of which weighed approximately as much as 30 of our suns, so they were very heavy, collided and formed one new black hole. But instead of weighing 60 suns, it only weighed 57. So in that tenth of a second, 3 solar masses just vaporized and was emanated as gravitational waves, which spread out for the next 1.3 billion years, and that's what we detected. So it was very significant. Now, how did they, do you want to know how they detected it? Is that too much?
Why not?
So to detect it, they built this amazing machine called LIGO, the Laser Interferometry Gravitational Wave Observatory. They built 2 of them, one in Washington State on the west coast of America and one in Louisiana. And it consists of 2 4-kilometre tubes, completely evacuated, with a laser beam going back and forth. And with extraordinary precision, they adjusted so the laser travelling all that enormous distance with a wavelength of a millionth of a metre, the 2 lasers in the 2 arms collide and annihilate each other under normal circumstances. But if a gravity wave comes along, it makes one of the arms extend and shrink because it's twisting, distorting space-time. So one of them extends, the one that's not in the direction of the gravity wave doesn't, and so the annihilation of the 2 laser beams is lost and you get a signal. Now that signal is small. Just to get a sense of the sensitivity, if you think about a piece of paper, I'm sure all of you got bits of paper in your hand, it's very thin. And if I said to you I wanted you to measure the length of a pen with the precision of the thickness of that paper, you'd say, I possibly might not be able to do it myself, but it's not that hard. You know, the thickness of a piece of paper over that length. But if I said I want you to measure the distance from Melbourne to Sydney to the precision of the thickness of a piece of paper, you said that's really hard because the machine you would use for measuring that distance, like a car counting rotations of the wheel, that doesn't have the sensitivity to measure the thickness of a piece of paper. Now if I said to you, I want you to measure the distance from here to Alpha Centauri, which is our nearest neighbour, 4.4 light years away. That's trillions and trillions and trillions of kilometres. And I want you to measure that to the precision of the thickness of a piece of paper. You'd say that's very hard. Well, that's what they did. It was an extraordinary effort.
I believe the Europeans are planning in, I think it's 2034, and if you read your free copies of Cosmos, you'll read about this. 2034, they're planning to have an equivalent experiment set up in space where rather than the arms of this equipment being 4 kilometres, they're talking about 1 million kilometres. And there's another experiment planned even further ahead where there'll be 4 of these European type units, and they believe that using that they will be able to measure waves that will take, the observation will take them back to within a fraction of a second after the Big Bang.
So that's the most important thing. You've got to say why. Who cares if you can measure these gravitational waves, right? Does it make a difference to your life? It makes a big difference to astronomers. So in the world of astronomy, we have radio telescopes, X-ray telescopes, optical telescopes. They're all fantastic. We've learned so much about the universe. But they're variations of a theme. X-rays, radio waves, light waves are what's called the electromagnetic spectrum, just different frequency components. Gravitational waves are completely different, and when we make more and more of these, there is one in Washington, one in Louisiana, there's one finishing up in Italy very soon, one underway in Japan, and a 5th one that's going to be built in India. You can use the coincident detection of a gravitational wave event to actually work out exactly where it came from. And so effectively you're making a telescope using gravitational waves. And that's important because parts of the origin of the universe are opaque to the electromagnetic spectrum. The first 380,000 years after the Big Bang, we can't see into it. And then for complicated reasons, the universe became visible. But about 150 million years, going out to 800 million years after the Big Bang, it became black again. Gravity waves don't care, they can see right through. So as Murray said, we'll be able to see back to the very, very origin of the universe.
Now there's something paradoxical about this, which I've never understood in cosmology. I am sitting here in 2016. The Big Bang has happened over in that corner there, 13.8 billion years ago. And yet I'm the result of that Big Bang. But here I am sitting observing what happened when the Big Bang occurred. I mean, I can't make any sense of that.
Just think of it as time travel. Our telescopes are giving us the ability to look back in the past. If you can understand time travel, you can understand that.
Now I understand everything. Thank you.
If I can just talk about what really fascinates me about this story. I could never have been one of the scientists who discovered a gravitational wave, because while the idea is fascinating, what they needed to do to discover it was really grudge work, busy work in a way. They weren't doing rocket science. These people were perfectionists, because, as Alan explained, to try to, one scientist described it as we're trying to measure the fluttering of an angel's wing. First of all, as a scientist, that would put me off totally. I mean, this just seems like hunting for unicorns. Even Einstein said it was impossible. Forget it. No, I'm not going to do that. Thank you. But they started seriously with the laser idea, as opposed to the original idea where they were using resonant bars and hoping to see a change in the resonance of this bar as a gravitational wave went past. They graduated to the idea of using lasers to do this in the 70s. So we're talking 50 years of over 1,000 scientists, and probably about 10 years ago they realised, look, we're so far out with the sensitivity of our instruments, it just looks impossible. And I had one scientist say this to me, that, most people just thought this was a ludicrous idea. And even when we could see, what we needed to be able to, what sort of tools we needed in terms of precision, we were orders of magnitude out. And yet they kept going. And it came down to how finely can you grind a mirror? How well can you hang these mirrors without friction? I mean, how well can you develop a coating so that these mirrors are so smooth that not even a single atom pops out? So this is not the sort of research I would ever be interested in, but that sort of mindset is what gave us gravitational waves.
Two quick comments. Albert Einstein, good boy. He said it would be hard, and we did it, as Elizabeth was just saying, with lasers. Laser stands for light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. Guess who theorised stimulated emission? Albert Einstein. That was in 1917, 2 years after he predicted gravitational waves, so it just comes back in again. One other comment is that, okay, so you're not astronomers, you think what else is useful? Well, the technology that... Can I call you Lizzie? No, Elizabeth. The technology that Elizabeth was talking about has been adapted into a new...
Okay, you can. Everybody here is our mishpucha anyway.
Into a satellite system called GRACE, which is being used at the moment. And there they've got two satellites that are chasing each other. One is chasing the other one around the Earth about 200 kilometres apart, using a laser beam to measure their exact distance. And let's say the first one's going across the Earth and there's a mountain. It tends to get attracted by the gravity of the mountain and goes a little bit faster, and so it extends away from the one that's trailing. Then it goes past the mountain and slows down, and the other one comes along and catches up. So they can map the contours of the Earth even for things that are not visible. So this GRACE satellite system is so sensitive, it can measure changes in the water table for underground water of 2 millimetres in height. So for mapping resources, it's a stunning feat. And that's a spin-off from the LIGO.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
And we should just say, out of the 1,000 scientists who did work to find gravitational waves, 50 of them were in Australia, and they made some pretty significant contributions, particularly in the coating of the mirrors, so that they weren't more than one atom sticking up and distorting the light.
That's wonderful. I think, if I've learnt nothing else, my big mistake was going into the lab. Einstein right. Stayed home and did all this stuff. Anyway, in 2000, we'll leave that for the moment. I mean, we could go on for hours about that, but we'll move on to our next topic. In 2000, pardon me, 13, scientists describe the ability to specifically target and then repair the genetic material in human and mouse cells. The methodology developed over a 20-year period from initial studies of how some bacteria defend themselves against viral attack. I don't know about you, but I find it quite humbling that some bacteria are better equipped to deal with viral infections than I am. But that aside, over the past 12 months, 2 research groups in China have reported using this editing system in non-viable human embryos. The prestigious scientific journals Science and Nature refused to publish the work on ethical grounds. While many scientists are calling for a worldwide ban on such research, others see the Chinese studies as the forerunners of inevitable future experimentation. And before I hand over, I'll hand over straight away to Elizabeth to explore some of the issues surrounding this highly controversial technology.
Thanks, Maury. So I might just recap quickly. So I think in 2012, two female scientists, Jennifer Doudna, who was at Berkeley, and I think Michelle Charpentier, her colleague, made this had this revelation about this discovery made in bacteria. So bacteria have an immune system, it turns out, and a very sophisticated one, much more sophisticated than we ever realised. And what they do is that they get invaded by viruses too, just like we do. And so our immune system, when we get invaded by viruses, we have immune cells, white cells, that keep a memory of those viruses and produce antibodies, and that's the basis of vaccines. So what bacteria do, if they get invaded by a virus, they make a little copy of that virus and they insert it in their genome, in their DNA code. And it's like they have, if you just imagine in their DNA code, they have a most wanted list of all these viruses that they've been invaded by. And as well as that, they have a missile to attack those viruses if they ever appear again. So what they do is they attach one of those posters for the most wanted onto their missile, and it's patrolling their cell, and if one of those viruses dares to appear, wham. And if it's a new virus that they haven't seen before, well, they make a little copy and they put it there in their most wanted list. So what these two female scientists discovered in 2012 is they took this system apart and they realised, wow, not only is this amazing, but we can see how to use this elsewhere. We can copy this. DNA is DNA. I'm sorry to tell you this, but your DNA is no different than a bacteria's DNA. Just, a few billion years advanced. A few billion years extra stuff. You've got 3 billion letters and a bacteria's got about 5,000. And so they succeeded, and it went faster than anybody could have imagined. The technique just worked so well. So we're talking 4 years from having figured out, deconstructed how this works in bacteria to, as you mentioned, this year, doing it in human embryos. And that's taken the world by shock. I could show you any number of cover pages from popular science magazines, like, how the world is about to change because now we can edit DNA any way we want. So I'm personally quite shocked, I think, because shocked that this has already happened in human embryos. And the reason I'm shocked is because most of my professional life as a journalist, which is going back more than 2 decades now, it's been axiomatic that we do not tamper with the human germline. By the human germline, I mean your eggs and your sperm. Because if you tamper with that, then you're kind of playing God in a way. You know, you're tampering with the genes of the rest of the human race forever. And we've actually been able to do this since 1970. So this new technique called CRISPR, yes, now we can do this to human embryos, we can do it to wheat and make it, you know, do all these wonderful things. We can make cows without horns, we can blah, 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 do anything you want really. But it's not really new. We've been able to do genetic engineering since the 1970s. And we have. We've been making, you know, all sorts of different kinds of crops, you know, rust-resistant, drought-resistant. We've made, some of you might remember the pigs that were made in the 80s that were very controversial because they were genetically engineered to grow faster. So in a way, none of this is new. And the reason I thought that we weren't doing it in human beings was because we'd set an ethical line that said, yes, go ahead, do it in pigs, do it in wheat, do it in whatever you like, but no, you mustn't do it in the human germline, in eggs or sperm. You could do genetic engineering, and indeed we did in adult human beings if there was a good medical cause. That was considered ethically acceptable. And some of you might remember the case in the end of 1979 where a young man by the name of Jesse Gelsinger was given genetically engineered cells to cure a fatal disease he had. He was only 18. And the way the genetic engineering was done was the gene to correct his problem was brought in on a virus. And this young man had a very severe reaction against that virus and died. And that brought the idea of human gene therapy, genetic engineering to a standstill. But I'm saying all this just to point out that CRISPR is not new. We've been able to do genetic engineering for 30, 40 years. And I always thought the reason we didn't try doing it in humans because we just said there's an ethical line in the sand we don't cross. So something I've believed was an axiom all my professional life. What? They're actually doing it. So it wasn't because of this ethical line in the sand. It was just that they didn't have a precise enough scalpel to do it. And now that they have a more precise scalpel, all the ethical arguments are suddenly up for revision. So, as Maury and I have just said, there have been 2 attempts so far that have been publicised in the literature to genetically engineer human embryos. These were both done in China. And they were not done to create a live human being. They were still at the experimental stage. But nevertheless, they caused shockwaves throughout the world because if people are actually doing it in a lab, well, what's going to stop it being done in the future? This is the first time it has ever been done in human embryos. And the first example of it was in April last year. The Chinese researchers took embryos that were known to have a form of anemia, beta thalassemia, and they tried to correct that defect. And they did correct it, but they also produced a lot of other errors in the DNA. And their takeaway message was, hey, world, this technology is not ready for prime time. And then just a few weeks ago, in April this year, they tried it again. And this time, their goal was to make embryos that would be resistant to HIV. And again, they succeeded, but not perfectly. It took only 10% of the embryos that they manipulated were successfully manipulated. So what we have now is the world is kind of still in shock, I would say. Last December, very much at the instigation of Jennifer Doudna, who was the scientist who discovered this in 2012, I think she's feeling a lot of mea culpa. Oh my God, I'm like, I'm like Frankenstein. Look what I've created, and I never meant this to happen. So she has really led the world's research community to examine what are the ethical implications of this. And unlike what happened in 1970, which was the last time the world's geneticists and ethicists came together to look at this question. So back in 1970, they all said, go ahead and do genetic engineering, but thou shalt not cross this line. Thou shalt not do anything with human embryos. This time they're not saying that. They're saying, don't do it yet. Don't try to manipulate embryos yet. Only do it in the lab. Do your research. But we're not ruling out that we might do this in the future. And one famous geneticist at Harvard by the name of George Church, he would be the most, I think, gung-ho of the geneticists from the point of view of we really should let this genie out of the bottle, because this is what we could do. And now bear in mind, the human population is ageing. We're adding 2.5 years to our average lifespan every decade. The next generation, this generation already, we have some wonderful nonagenarians who are here tonight and participating, and they're a great inspiration. Next generation, my son's generation, we're going to have centenarians. So what George Church would argue is that, Victor, your children, you should consider genetically engineering them. Wouldn't you want to give them, given that they're all going to, you'll probably live to 100, they'll probably live to 120. Don't you want them to have anti-dementia genes? Wouldn't you like to give them anti-cancer genes? We can do it. We can do it. What else can we do? We know that by 2030 we're sending the first humans to Mars. And wouldn't it be good if we could give them radiation resistance, because that's going to be a big problem on that year they spend in the spaceship. They're going to get lots of rads. And their bone density is going to suffer. We can make human beings that are radiation resistant and high bone density. So these are the arguments we're wrestling with now. And because we can, technology has pushed the ethical goalposts, which I'm still coming to terms with.
Yes. No, it's astounding.
Murray, can I just add a couple of things, purely from a practical point of view, because I'm the engineer and being practical is always a consideration. What staggers me is beyond the moral aspect that Elizabeth was talking about. This is one of the only times I've ever heard of anything being done in humans without first going through small animals, larger animals, and non-human primates, monkeys. So they haven't actually done it in viable embryos yet, but for them to consider doing that before they go through the normal process that you would have to do for any drug is staggering. The second thing, and this is the biggest practical concern, people will say that the first human being to live to 150 has probably already been born. That's how fast longevity is improving with technology, but Alzheimer's and other diseases of aging are a problem. So if you identify a gene and you think you can fix the problem, your experimental life cycle is 100 years. You've got to do it and then wait 100 years before you know whether there were any adverse side effects or whether it was actually successful. So the challenges of bringing this kind of technology to market from the practical point of view, even beyond the moral point of view, are staggering. And I have no idea how that will be addressed.
It reminds me of my favourite science cartoon where there's the typical white-coated scientist and he's holding his flask and he says, well, we've discovered the secret of immortality, but it's going to take forever to prove it.
That's right. So, Maury, you made the comment before that you were humbled by the bacteria, but you tell better jokes than the average bacteria.
I found a quote, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Medical Ethics. Now, I don't know anything about this journal. It may only sell 3 copies, but he is quoted as saying that creating designer babies could be considered a moral obligation. That's something to think about. But I think one of the one of the things that's seen as incredibly powerful in the CRISPR technology is that you can do multiple genes at the one time. It lends itself in a way to social engineering. I mean, if you could get rid of all of the psychopathic genes in the genome, if there is a suite of genes, for example, for that sort of thing. Intelligence, could we improve on that through engineering? These are questions that I guess people are going to wrestle with, but I think the technology is just astonishing. It's remarkable.
If I can just say, the Jewish philosophical imperative of tikkun olam, fix the world, is sort of interesting here. So at Cosmos, one of our regular columnists is Laurie Zoloth, and so she's our philosopher. And and generally she's really a technical optimist. So this is a question that she wrestled with in one of her columns, and this is what she said in her final line. So given that we, as you say, we could genetically engineer people to be more intelligent, not have schizophrenia, more cogently, avoid dementia and cancer for people who are going to be living to 120. Should we do it? And she says, look, I suspect we would reach the same conclusions we did 30 years ago, because she was one of the scientists at when they decided not to tamper with the sperm and eggs 30 years ago. And that is, our knowledge of unforeseen consequences is too poor, our capacity for greed and narcissism too strong, our society already too unjust to begin to design babies to a spec sheet. So that's her Jewish philosopher perspective.
But it's interesting that
tikkun olam.
Technology outpacing regulation, in that the FDA, when the rules were drawn up about genetic engineering, just looked at putting bits of extra DNA into organisms. There are plants that are basically bypassing the regulatory process because they're deleting bits of information, and there's nothing to cover that. So they can just go through and out into the world. So things are just going at a pace that, the law has always run very, very slow compared to what's happening in science, particularly in this area. But even the regulatory bodies are having terrible problems. But let's just move on to our last topic for this evening. And the quote, "Everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it," is generally attributed to Mark Twain. And I'm just going to say that. While there is some debate, although not with you obviously, about its true origin, there is no question that many scientists are now demanding that something be done about the weather. Arguably the most politicised scientific issue in recent times has been that of climate change. And fierce debates continue inside and outside Parliament, with conflicting interpretations of data, arguments about the validity of predictive weather models, and print sub-editors condensing complex scientists into simple catchphrases. What will the average punter make of all of this? Now, Elizabeth is going to quickly go through some of the media debate that's occurring, and I've got some things here, I think. Headlines like "Shift to lower emission to cost us billions," and there are some headlines that are screaming even more hysterically about things like this. And then Alan will talk about, he'll assess the feasibility of aiming towards a net zero carbon emission world. So if we could start with you, Elizabeth, thank you.
So I'll try to be pretty quick. So I'm just going to talk about, as an editor of a magazine, the challenge of reporting on climate change. So You can see it done appallingly by the Herald Sun. The quote by Bertrand Russell comes to mind. "The trouble with the world is that the ignorant are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt." And the Australian has been downright idiotic in some of its reporting. A frontline story on wind farm syndrome, based on 5 people trumpeting the fact that the NH and MRC in their review on this topic didn't pick it up, but this study of 5 people did. How insulting to the intelligence of Australians. So what do these stories illustrate? I think that, on the other hand, I should say some media do it brilliantly. The Guardian Australia does great stuff. You know, I take my hat off to them, and we at Cosmos, we try to do a good job too with our Climate Watch. But it is a challenge to report climate science because there's a bit of a cultural disconnect. So when you report for the general media, you know, there's a concept of framing a story. You know, you tell the people what the message is. You don't leave wiggle room, and it's A, B, C, D. This is the story, well framed. Science is not a framing culture. Science is all about uncertainty. It's an iterative process where scientists debate with each other, they destroy each other's arguments. You know, it's a culture that's built on conflict, and very, very few things you can put on a pedestal will stay there within, you know, a few years' time. So how do you reconcile those two things? Some in the media who have particular agendas, or whether they just are part of these cocksure people that Bertrand Russell described, they have exploited that apparent indecisiveness of the scientific process to say, well, the scientists aren't sure, so we should not, you know, don't put too much weight on this. So that's kind of absurd, really. I mean, my husband is going, and my children, although I've forbidden them all to do this, are planning to go up on Virgin Galactic, and I'm still forbidding you all to do this. But I'm quite sure if they were given odds of 95% that this plane is likely to crash, that they would not do this. Yeah. And these are the sort of odds that we have at the moment with our planet. You know, we are predicting our planet is going to go into a global warming crash. You know, so would we board that rocket? So these are the sort of arguments that climate skeptics, or worse, the deniers who are saying, just don't worry about that. The scientists, they don't know what they're talking about. This one says this one says this, they disagree. So where I'm going with this is the challenge. It's a challenge for journalists to translate scientific culture into tabloid or the journalism you're going to read in your newspapers or online. So just to give you one example, NASA itself reported in 2013 that, you know, there's something interesting going on here. Whereas the data from the 1900s has been showing a sharp rise in global temperatures, something interesting has sort of happened between 2000 and 2010. We seem to be having a hiatus, a slowing down of global warming. It's not quite going up at the rate we saw before. And of course all the deniers jump up and down and say, you see, you know, they don't know what they're talking about. But, you know, you can leave it to the scientists to cut each other down. So last year there was a study in, might have been Science, and it said, you know what, that 10-year slowdown wasn't a slowdown at all. When we, you know, tweak the data a bit, you know, it's based on certain records here and there and measuring sea temperatures and surface temperatures, it doesn't look like there was a slowdown at all. In February of this year, another group say, no, actually the slowdown was real, but we think it was because there was less volcanic activity, and again, something to do with not measuring ocean temperatures properly. So anyway, what I'm saying here is, this is the culture of science. Scientists are always at each other's throat trying to tear each other down, and they are saying, nevertheless, even with a potential slowdown over the last 10-year period, nevertheless, they're saying with 95% confidence that we're headed for major trouble. So I think we need to believe them, and we've had a very sobering year. We are already, April was the hottest year on record. We've already had hottest year on record, 2015 was hottest year on record, but April jumped ahead by an unprecedented amount. We've seen bleaching across 93% of the Great Barrier Reef. A famous reef, Loomis Reef off Lizard Island, is 50% of it is probably completely destroyed. So that's the challenge. So I hand over
Well,
to...
I just might make one comment in that scientists understand what consensus means. For the lay public, it's being portrayed, if it's not 100%, then you've got some people who are arguing against it, therefore you can't be sure that this is actually what's happening. And Andrew Bolt described those who support the consensus position as warmists, who by definition are driven by ideology and are unreliable. And you can say what you like about him, but he has a huge audience, and people read him and they just take him at face value. So it's a serious problem, and it's a difficult one for scientists to deal with, to be able to communicate in a way that I guess an aspect that I'd like to explore, perhaps if we've got time, is education, in that in general people don't understand the way that science works, what a hypothesis is, what happens when people challenge a hypothesis, that things do change, models change to adapt to errors in the data, and there's a lack of understanding of that. So, Alan, I'll hand over to you.
So your question was, how would we move towards a zero emissions world? So let me take you through 4 or 5 steps that would get us there. The first one is to acknowledge the problem. Elizabeth was talking about that, you were responding on consensus, but just look at the data. So when I went to school, carbon dioxide was about 280 parts per million. Last month in the southern hemisphere, it just broke through 400 parts per million. Carbon dioxide is basic physics. It traps heat. So if carbon dioxide goes up, we will trap heat on the planet. And that's what we're seeing. Elizabeth mentioned it, but let me just emphasise that in the last 12 months, every single month for the last 12 months has been the hottest month on record for the corresponding month. We've never seen anything like this. Paris is aiming to stop the temperature rise at about 1.5 degrees. 2 is the sort of don't go there line, but 1.5 is what they're aiming for. We're sitting at about 1.3. We're very close. So the evidence is overwhelming. Carbon dioxide's going up, the temperature's going up. Let's think about what we can do about it. And fundamentally, we have to reduce the cause, the underlying problem. It's not you or me or the behaviour, it's carbon dioxide going up. Maybe as a result of our behaviour, but the carbon dioxide's the problem. So how do you deal with that? A number of different ways. One that a lot of people recommend, and it's not unreasonable, it's an important thing to try, is greening. Do as much as we can to green the planet. Plant more trees, plant more grasses. Try to regrow on land that is being cleared. And it's both good and bad. The problem with that is that you can't do it forever. And so if you're relying on planting forests to reduce carbon dioxide, you might get a reduction in carbon dioxide, but eventually you'll run out of new land, and you've not done anything, if you're relying on that, about the fundamental release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as we burn coal and oil and other things for energy. So the benefit of greening is that you can take people have predicted you can take a couple of billions and dollars go together, I guess, a couple of billion tonnes of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by planting just more and more trees year after year, maybe for 20 or 30 years, but you can't do it forever. But it's a good thing to do. It gives us time to address other problems. The next thing that one has to do is reduce. There's two areas we can reduce. We can reduce how much energy we use for our needs, and that's efficiency. So having better insulated houses with double glazed glass, using LEDs instead of old-fashioned lights. We can make our consumption practices, driving better cars, we can make our consumption practices a lot more efficient, and we need to strive to do that, and that gives us a permanent improvement in our profile. The other way we can reduce is by making manufacturing processes more efficient, and that's called energy productivity. Can you produce the same goods with less input energy? And governments all around the world are encouraging industry to do that, and there are metrics in place. The Australian government's current target is a 40% reduction in the energy cost of making something by the year 2030. So that's reductions. The next thing, of course, is to improve the generation capacity. And there are a lot of different ways we can generate electricity with lower emissions than what we do at the moment. We've got nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, wave power, tidal power, biomass. There are tons and tons of technologies that we can use instead of coal and oil and natural gas to get us electricity without producing carbon dioxide emissions. But the reality is most of them don't work out. Wave power, people have tried for decades, it's never economical, it's too hard. The sea is too rough, and same with tidal power. Geothermal, just never panned out. Hydroelectricity, has anybody got any idea when the last time that Australia built a major hydroelectric dam? It was 45 years ago, the Snowy Mountain schemes. There's just no appetite for flooding valleys in most developed countries. So even though hydro is the best form of electricity because it's clean, you can turn it up when you need it, it's unlimited storage capacity, it's perfect, but we're just not going to build any more. Nuclear is probably got the lowest or second lowest carbon dioxide emissions profile. I don't have to take you through the reasons that it's unlikely to become a common form of power generation in our country or most Western countries. So at the end of the day, it leaves solar and wind, and they're actually really good. And they're getting better. So because of government subsidies, all around the world we've been investing in wind and solar, and that's increased the volume of manufacturing. As the volume of manufacturing goes up, the prices come down. If you go back 30 years, electricity from wind was 10 times more expensive than it is today. If you go back the same 30 years, electricity from solar was 60 times more expensive than it is today. Not only have we seen this massive reduction, but we've crossed a critical threshold. So historically, the metric for cheap electricity comes from coal. Coal electricity is incredibly cheap. You go to your lawn, the big open cut mines, the machine takes a 5-ton handful, drops it on a conveyor belt, goes into a burner. You get electricity. What could be cheaper? Well, that comes out to about 5.5 cents wholesale for electricity. Well, the wholesale cost for large wind farms now is 5 cents, so it's cheaper than coal. And the wholesale unsubsidised price for solar, the unsubsidised price for solar is 5 cents, and the unsubsidised price for wind is 4 cents. They're both cheaper than coal. It is time to declare victory on our ability to generate solar and wind electricity is absolutely carbon dioxide emissions free. So the challenge now is to scale it up. But there's another obvious problem. Wind and solar, they're intermittent. In winter you don't get that much sun,
And sometimes the wind doesn't blow and you've got the combination of no sun and no wind. It's tough. So we need to have storage technologies and alternatives. And that's the next big challenge. And there are many different ways you can deal with this. You can use biomass to make electricity. So when there's no wind and no sun, you just start burning a lot of wood to make electricity. You can use what hydro we've got. You can use high voltage interconnectors to send the wind electricity from where it's generated to where it's needed, because you typically don't have the doldrums everywhere on a continent. And if you invest in high voltage connectors to ship the electricity, that's very good too. But the one that's most exciting at the moment is batteries. But the challenge is big. I mean, I think most of you would be aware that batteries are getting better and better and cheaper. The price for large batteries for an electric car has come down by a factor of 4 in the last 9 years. It was unimaginable to me. I was in the industry 5 or 6 years ago. It was unimaginable that the price would come down so quickly. And now Tesla and LG and Samsung are making batteries, big ones, to hold big units of electricity, 10 kilowatt hours, so that people with solar can run overnight from the solar electricity that they generated during the day. But let me illustrate how big the challenge is. If you went back to 2014, and I go to 2014 because it's the last year I've got the figures, and you took all the batteries that were made for any purpose, for laptops, for phones, for cars, for industry, and you removed all of the laptops made in 2014 and brought them all together into a big storage facility for backing up the grid, and you had an international connection, you connected all the electricity of the whole world together, and you charged up the batteries. Now, I'm talking about all the batteries that were made in 2014, and you charged up the batteries, and then you switched off the generators. How long could those batteries keep the planet going? A minute, half an hour, 2 hours, 9 seconds. 9 seconds. That's how big the challenge is. Now, I don't say that to say it's impossible, just to say that there's a lot to be done. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, is building what he calls a gigafactory. And these gigafactories, he uses giga, it's a prefix for very, very big. This gigafactory will put out batteries per year at about 7 times the rate of the whole of the 2014 worldwide manufacturing, just from one factory. But the factory's not cheap. It's $5 billion to build. And on today's battery prices, it's going to put out $5 billion of batteries. If all you ever did was replace storage with, use batteries for storage, and you wanted to get 10 days, you'd be spending $5 trillion a year for the next 5 years. 2 things. First of all, you won't do that because you will use high voltage interconnectors and hydrogen storage and water storage and other storages, but they all cost money too. The important thing is to recognise that $5 trillion, US dollars, real ones, $5 trillion, it's not that much. It's a big number, but we've got to face it. Currently, in 2015, the world spent $329 billion US dollars on renewable energy, 250 billion the year before. Bloomberg Financial suggesting that it will get to about $5 trillion in 2030. But the other way of realising that it's not an unreasonable amount is the IMF, which is, I think, the most credible economics analysis entity in the world, the International Monetary Fund. They came out with a report just about a month ago which looked at the implied subsidies for fossil fuels. So, for example, in Indonesia, people pay cents per litre, just a few cents per litre, because the government doesn't use international pricing. You get the same in Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. The implied subsidy for fossil fuels is about $5 trillion a year. So if we could just shift from that implied subsidy to investing in renewable energies and storage, we could make it. But that's not the end of the story. So if we did that, we would replace all of our electricity with clean electricity, and that would be wonderful. That would reduce by 30, maybe 40% the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. What we have to do is build all of that again so that we can replace petrol and diesel in transport with electric vehicles. And then build it all again so that we can replace gas for heating and commercial and industrial applications. And if we do that, we will truly have close to a zero emissions planet. And I have a term for it. I call it the electric planet.
It's wonderful. Well, I don't know what the time. I know what the time is, but how are we going for? Are we allowed to stay here all night, or? I'll just throw it open to the floor. Before I do that, I might just say that there's one person here who's just sobbing with happiness that you are the chief scientist, and he's sitting over there. He's an engineer, and when he heard that you'd been appointed, he was inconsolable with happiness.
There are two. I have to correct you. My mother is in the front row, just here.
But I'm sure George's wish would be never stop thinking like an engineer. Okay, lots of questions. Wonderful. If we can make them short.
Yes, Peter Cohen. I'm also an electrical engineer, but if I may update you on the situation of wave generation, there are now 2 successful wave generators operating, one of which, an Australian development, has survived storms. Microphone switched. Oh, that's better. Okay, if I may update you on wave technology, there are now 2 apparently successful ways of developing power from the waves. One is an Australian development, which has been generating electricity for over 12 months and is also operating a desalination plant. And the other one comes from an Israeli company, which is operating which is connected to the Gibraltar grid. So yes, wave tech, and the Australians on Garden Island in Western Australia, the Australian company Carnegie Energy is now developing a system by which the whole island, which is a naval base, will be completely independent of clean methods of producing electricity, and they have a contract to do the same in Mauritius. So yeah, wave energy is definitely there.
Peter, I'll have to beg to differ. I'm familiar with Carnegie, I'm familiar with Polaris and many other companies, and for 20 or 30 years companies have been developing wave energy, and conceptually and technologically it's terrific, and the result is clean electricity, there's no question of it. But the ocean is a difficult place, and you put in wave installations and something goes wrong, the cost of repairing it and the time taken to repair it is out of all reasonable bounds. And so yes, Carnegie exists and Polaris in Scotland, and I don't know about the Israeli one. Their contribution after 20 or 30 years of effort is to be lauded, but it's at the level of 0.0000001% of the electricity that we use today, and it is so far behind wind and solar that the prospects of it ever catching up and making a significant contribution are infinitesimal. I'm not saying it's a bad technology, it's a good, clean technology, but and if people invest in it, wonderful. But it's nothing we can rely on to break the back of the problem.
Just talk. Can you hear me? Assuming that tomorrow morning you conquered the carbon issue and there is no carbon anymore, and I suspect then that's not the end of the story. The solar panel, the solar system is so large and the seas are so enormous that temperature is historically come up and come down. There's cold periods, there's freezing periods, and why isn't it not just one of those hot periods that may or may not go away?
So the question is, are what we're seeing just part of the natural cycle as the Earth gets closer or further from the sun, or just geological implications and ocean currents and things like that? And there are many reasons, I think, to think it's not as simple as that. We can't just assume that it's that. First of all, the speed of temperature increase and the speed of carbon dioxide increase has never been paralleled in any of the records that we can measure. So we can measure with great resolution up to about almost 1 million years ago from ice cores in the Antarctic. And the rate of change that we're seeing at the moment of carbon dioxide is well in excess of 10 times faster than anything seen, probably 100 times faster. And same with temperature increases. We've never seen anything like it. And you can go with less resolution across the geological record from doing many other techniques, and still we've never seen anything like it.
plus, I revert back to fundamental physics. As an electrical engineer, I did a lot of physics, and you can't beat fundamental physics. Carbon dioxide, you can do it in the lab. It absorbs infrared radiation, but it does not absorb visible light and ultraviolet light. So visible light and ultraviolet light come through the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide concentration doesn't matter. They hit the ground, they heat the ground re-radiates infrared. That's trapped by the increasing levels of carbon dioxide. That's called the greenhouse effect. It's basic physics. Something must be happening as a result of carbon dioxide levels going up. It can't not happen. So there's no doubt that burning fossil fuels is increasing carbon dioxide. You can just see it in the record from the Industrial Revolution. And I should have pointed out, not only was last year the worst in terms of temperature increases, but it was also the worst year in terms of carbon dioxide increases. So for all the effort we've put into wind and solar, last year carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere went up by 3.05 parts per billion, which was the biggest one-year increase ever. So we are putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It is a greenhouse gas. It will cause temperature rise. That to me is incontrovertible. What is subject to a lot of debate amongst the scientific community, in any community, is exactly how that will manifest itself. So the climate change impacts are complex, and that depends on modelling. It's not basic physics anymore. These are complex systems that interact in many, many different ways. That I'm not sure of. In other words, if the temperature goes up by 3 degrees, what will that do to rainfall? What will that do to ocean acidification, etc.? Very difficult. But what you can assume is it's not going to be what we want. We're happy with the climate we have. We didn't choose it, but we've evolved into it. And if we're pushing it away from this position, I don't think that can be good. And for the reasons of basic physics, we are pushing our climate away from where it has historically been. It can't just be natural variations. It's too fast, and there are fundamental contributors there.
I just want to go back to the question about DNA manipulation. And there was, sorry, I'm over here.
Right.
You talked about changing characteristics, in particular with regard to health. I'm just wondering whether or not a move to making the human being an asexual being, in other words, doing away with our with the requirement to reproduce with another partner, may be part of the game. And what do you think about? Well,
Get out.
That's right. And hand in your credentials as human being.
And I guess in some ways that was triggered by you talking about this happening in China, which are facing some problems with their one-child policy or implications of that.
There are other methods of contraception, I think, that are simpler. Yeah.
Alan, it's Robin Schwartz. I want to ask you, as somebody who bridges the world of science and the commercial world, how do they coexist or work together when science has an imperative of collaboration and transparency, and the commercial world's about competition and commercial in confidence, and I don't understand how it works. Or does it work?
It does, and the answer is probably because things aren't quite as black and white as that. Not all scientists collaborate, and not all businesses are constantly competing. Businesses in particular recognise the benefits of collaboration to a point, and then going off and competing. But there are many examples. So probably the best example of innovation in our country is not in the digital technology area, but in mining. Rio Tinto runs their mines in the Pilbara from a control room that is like a NASA control room in Perth. And from there they run the mine in the Pilbara, another one in Mongolia, and they supervise and run parts of a mine in Arizona. And the mine in the Pilbara, the 350-tonne trucks are autonomous. That means there are no drivers. They're given their mission from the control room in Perth. The underground drilling machines are controlled from Perth. And the trains are now driverless. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because they commissioned from the University of Sydney and University of Queensland, a lot of the work on the control algorithms for that robotics, the intelligence behind that. So that was industry and university working well together. And they put together consortia of companies to provide the various pieces of what they needed. And really, Rio Tinto didn't do a lot of the development work. They managed a collaborative process across multiple companies, at least 2 universities, delivering product for themselves that gave cost advantages, environmental advantages, and safety advantages. So there are examples there. I agree with you, it's difficult, but with good intention and good practices, we can do it very effectively.
As you move towards understanding the origins of the world, and I don't know what time frame you're giving for that, what impact is it going to have on formal religion?
So what impact will it have on?
Formal religion.
I should defer, but I'm too silly.
What, to me?
No, to someone else. I don't think it'll make any impact. Science has already come up with the theory of the origin of the universe being from an event called the Big Bang, and then 13.7 billion years of evolution, growth of the universe and evolution to bring us to where we're at. And as we look further back, we'll get more detail. I'm not expecting that we'll be surprised and see a supreme creator or anything like that. I think we'll just learn more detail about what we already think is happening. It might dramatically change how we think it's playing out, but to me, the reconciliation between science and religion is to not try to see them as competing, but as coexisting. That, the question, I'm not sure everybody heard it, was can they coexist, or is one correct and the other one incorrect? That's going to come back to every individual person's personal interpretation.
If I can make a comment here. So putting together, as the editor of the magazine, it is very hard work, but what really keeps me going is I feel like I'm travelling to the corners of the universe, and I'm in a constant state of elation and reverence. And so many of the stories we do are that they are so fantastic, they almost feel religious. They're sort of so beyond the bounds of our intuitive ability to grasp them. So the story that's in our next issue is on antimatter. So our universe was created, and apparently from everything we know from experiments and we do when we crash matter together to recreate the Big Bang, matter and antimatter is always created in equal quantities. But somehow our universe is almost entirely made of matter. So it's a mystery that they're trying to solve now. And just like with the story of being able to finally detect gravitational waves, we are coming up with completely fantastical instruments to try to detect, to try to answer this question of why did matter win the story of creation. Or, a previous issue we did looking at dark matter. Most of the material in the universe we can't detect. It's called dark matter, and we're doing experiments at the moment to try to detect that. So I would suggest to you that maybe your religious impulse to understand the mystery of the universe might be somewhat satisfied by reading Cosmos magazine.
Perhaps just one last question, as we're almost at 8:30. Annie.
This may be a naive question, but given that we have this indisputable evidence of the warming, why is it that our government has actually reduced funding towards alternate energies development?
Do you know that this is what's called the caretaker period? And during caretaker period, only politicians are allowed to make public statements. Anybody who's contracted to the government shouldn't. It really comes down to philosophical differences. So, for example, people slam the direct action plan because they don't like it, but they haven't analysed it. So direct action that the government's been putting a few $1 billion into is the most cost-effective on the metrics method of reducing carbon. So for like $10 or $11, you can eliminate a tonne of carbon dioxide, whereas solar and wind historically have been much more than that, but they're probably still in the $20 to $30 level. So it's not that the government's not doing anything at all. It's a question of, is it doing what you or others might want them to be doing? The government went to Paris with an open mind and helped to bring the Pacific nations along and part of the coalition of 177 nations making the big statement. And I think they have committed to significant reductions, not as much as what perhaps what a lot of people would want, but it's going to be revised in 5 years from now anyway. That's part of the Paris Accords. So every 5 years, nations are going to take on new voluntary emissions goals. I'm not sure that anybody's got the right formula yet. What I'm pushing for is, in a sense, what you're pushing for. It's that whatever we're doing across the world, it's got to be done at much, much bigger scale. And the bigger the size of the challenge, the more important it is to start early, because it takes a long time to where you're going. And I don't think anywhere in the world people have comprehended what a big challenge it is. We get excited because China is investing in a lot of wind. India is investing in massive amounts of solar. What we forget is they're investing in a lot more coal-fired electricity at the same time. They have no choice. They have populations that are coming from total poverty towards middle class, and they expect electricity. And you can't deny them the opportunity to have electricity. And until we can crack the cost and scaling of battery storage and high voltage interconnects and things like that, we have an ongoing problem. So we have to do the most that we can do, but we can't do it like that, even though I wish that we could.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Alan. It's been a fantastic session. Thank you.